On January 26, 3 Atlas was reported to be absorbing nearly all sound-related signals, while a massive dark spherical object suddenly appeared in the space between 3 Atlas and Earth. This mysterious artificial sphere was described as possessing seemingly impossible characteristics, including an almost perfectly precise geometric roundness, near total thermal absorption, and a material density exceeding that of any known natural element. At the same time, analyses of radio signals detected at the atomic hydrogen frequency, along with signs of deliberate mechanical control, have raised the suspicion that the sphere is initiating a calculated form of communication with 3I Atlas, especially as 3I Atlas is believed to be decelerating, as if preparing for a rendezvous planned long in advance. When observatories speak to deep space, the conversation depends on one quiet promise, because a transmitted radar or radio pulse should return with a predictable echo, and that echo is how astronomy turns darkness into testable numbers. Atlas breaks that promise in a way that forces a hypothesis-first reading, because multiple stations reported a return amplitude near 0.03%, while transmission power, pointing geometry, and calibration baselines stayed within normal tolerances. The same workflow maps near-Earth asteroids, where radar cross-section and Doppler spread constrained size, spin, and surface roughness, yet at last yields a near-null response, even when frequency bands and integration windows are varied to reduce false negatives. A low return can arise from distance, beam misalignment, plasma noise, or a surface that absorbs strongly, but the Atlas profiles remain suppressed across broad frequencies, which shifts the problem from bad geometry toward unusual material behavior, or unmodelled propagation. If at last were only dark, then thermal and optical channels would still supply a complementary signature, and those signatures would let researchers close the loop on albedo and temperature. Yet cross-checks fail to restore ordinary consistency, and the error budget will not absorb the gap. One sober bridge hypothesis treats Atlas as a natural aggregate, with extreme porosity and carbon-rich mantling, because a fluffy matrix can trap incident radiation through repeated internal scattering, and a complex crust can mimic engineered absorption without any intention behind the physics. Another bridge hypothesis treats the at-last measurements as evidence of a corridor effect along the line of sight, where signal energy is degraded before reaching receivers by a medium that is not normally present, and that possibility links to later reports of structured timing and geographic alignment on Earth. The unease does not come from spectacle, because the deeper discomfort comes from realizing that Atlas turns a simple question, what is out there, into a harder one. What rules are doing the measuring, night after night, and that is the transition into the next section, where pattern replaces anomaly, and geometry begins to look like intent. The first reports of acoustic dampening did not arrive as a dramatic headline, because the earliest indicators were quiet deviations inside routine atmospheric telemetry, yet at last was already in the background of every calculation as the only new variable that refused to behave normally. Sound in air is mechanical transfer, a chain of collisions that should attenuate smoothly with distance and humidity, and when instruments began logging zones where propagation efficiency dropped sharply inside clean geographic boundaries, the data looked less like weather and more like a rule being rewritten. Atlas matters here because the centers of these dampening zones appeared to align toward Atlas's current position with deviations measured in fractions of a degree, and that alignment is the kind of geometry that turns coincidence into a testable question. A single zone could be explained locally through temperature inversions, pressure gradients, sensor drift, or interference in the sampling pipeline, but multiple zones on separate continents forming within hours compress the probability space until random becomes an increasingly expensive explanation. The anomaly deepens because the dampening is not just a soft muffling, since measurements imply that vibrational energy is being lost faster than standard thermodynamic models permit, and the atmosphere behaves as if it is bleeding coherence out of sound itself. Atlas becomes the bridge again when timing enters the picture, because the onset of each zone appears after a consistent delay following a specific geometric threshold, and the repeatability suggests a mechanism that can be triggered rather than a storm that simply happens. One cautious hypothesis treats the pattern as an observational artifact amplified by confirmation bias, where analysts overfit alignment after noticing at last, yet independent verification across networks weakens that comfort and pushes the mind toward structure. Another hypothesis treats the dampening as a field effect that couples to air density or molecular vibration only along a narrow corridor, and if at last is shaping that corridor, then Earth is not merely observing at last, because at last is quietly selecting where Earth can listen. To model the dampening zones without leaping to conclusions, the first step is to treat the atmosphere as a medium whose effective acoustic impedance has been altered, because sound speed, absorption, and scattering all depend on pressure, temperature, humidity, and microstructure in ways that can be quantified. Atlas sits at the edge of the model as an external driver, not because Atlas must be causal, but because the alignment statistics keep dragging Atlas back into the equation whenever the geometry is replotted. A baseline approach assumes ordinary meteorology, then asks what parameter shifts could produce a sharp boundary where sound transmission drops by tens of %, and the uncomfortable answer is that the required gradients are too steep to hide inside normal atmospheric variation. A second approach treats the zone as an energy sink, where acoustic energy is converted into another channel, yet known mechanisms such as turbulence, aerosols, and thermal conduction cannot account for losses that appear to violate expected conservation rates at the measured scales. Atlas therefore becomes the bridge to a more speculative framework, where the medium is not only air but the local structure of space-time that defines how oscillations propagate, and a tiny change in coupling constants could behave like a new kind of friction that does not heat the air in the usual way. The emotional weight is subtle, because the fear is not loud, it is quiet, and the quiet is precisely what the instruments are describing. At last remains the transition point, because if the dampening grows stronger over time, then the model must include a ramp function, and ramp functions imply a process that is turning on rather than a coincidence that is fading out. At last is not unsettling only because of what Earth may be experiencing, since at last was already unusual long before any dampening zones were mapped, and the interstellar origin of at last frames every anomaly inside a larger context of unfamiliar initial conditions. An interstellar trajectory is not a poetic label, it is a mathematical fingerprint, because a hyperbolic path implies that Atlas is not bound to the Sun, and that at last entered the system with excess velocity, carrying a history written under another star's gravity. Atlas should still obey the same fundamental dynamics once inside the solar system, and that is why early tracking mattered so much, because orbital solutions refined over time should converge as more astrometry accumulates. Yet Atlas has been described as resisting clean convergence in ways that raise questions about non-gravitational forces. Comets can deviate through outgassing because jets of sublimating volatiles act like tiny thrusters, and radiation pressure can add a small push. Yet the behavioral patterns attributed to Atlas have been framed as inconsistent with the usual cometry signatures that accompany such forces. Atlas also complicates spectroscopic expectations, because composition estimates typically fall into recognizable families of ice, dust, and organics, while Atlas is repeatedly described as refusing to settle into a stable interpretive category across different observational bands. The cautious bridge is that Atlas may be a rare natural object, a fractured body with unusual thermal inertia, layered mantles, and an orientation that hides its most diagnostic features, and the universe has always punished overconfidence when samples are small. The sharper bridge is that Atlas could be an engineered system using controlled thrust or field interactions, because controlled behavior produces repeatable deviations, and repeatability is the one trait that nature imitates imperfectly. The emotion here is not panic, but attention, because Atlas forces a choice between expanding our natural taxonomy or admitting a new class of actor, and the transition is inevitable, since the next question is whether Atlas is merely passing through, or whether Atlas is slowly increasing its influence as the hours accumulate. The most revealing detail is not that dampening exists, but that dampening appears to strengthen with each later formation, because a rising curve carries more information than a single point ever can, and Atlas sits at the far end of that curve like a clock face no one asked for. If Zone 1 shows a moderate reduction, and Zone 4 shows a deeper reduction, then the simplest reading is escalation. Yet escalation can emerge from mundane causes such as improved detection sensitivity, shifting baselines, or the statistical bias of noticing stronger events first. Atlas complicates that comfort, because the timing pattern does not behave like random weather, and the alignment pattern does not behave like independent noise, so the idea of an external driver returns even when the analyst tries to close the case with ordinary explanations. A ramping effect can be modelled as a system approaching steady state, where a field gradually reaches operational amplitude, and in engineering that behaviour is common because power systems stabilise, feedback loops settle, and thresholds are crossed in stages rather than instantly. Atlas therefore invites a hypothesis that feels almost too deliberate, where Atlas is not producing a single event but is executing a sequence, and the sequence is not aimed at destruction, but at calibration, because calibration is what you do when you need the environment to respond in a predictable way. The bridge to safety is that nature also calibrates, because tides, resonances, and plasma interactions can build gradually as geometry changes, and an interstellar object moving through different heliospheric conditions can trigger nonlinear effects without intention. Yet Atlas remains in the centre of the frame because the delay appears to be shrinking, and a shrinking delay is the signature of acceleration in the coupling itself, not just in the motion of Atlas across the sky. The emotion is a quiet pressure, the sense that something is waking up rather than passing by, and the transition is clear, because once a process is ramping, the next step is to ask what mechanism controls the timing, and why the number 47 minutes repeats like a measured breath in the dark. A repeated delay is not just a detail, because time is the easiest variable to test and the hardest variable to fake, and when the onset of each dampening zone follows the same interval after a specific alignment threshold, the pattern begins to look like a protocol rather than a coincidence. Atlas becomes the reference point for that protocol, since the geometry is defined by Atlas' position relative to each location on Earth, and the delay is measured from the moment Atlas crosses an angular condition that can be computed with high precision. If the interval were roughly similar, then human pattern seeking could explain the impression of order. Yet the claim of a near-identical 47 minutes across separate events compresses the probability of random alignment, because independent atmospheric anomalies do not normally share a synchronized clock. One conservative mechanism treats the delay as a propagation time through a medium, where a disturbance travels along a corridor and arrives after a fixed transit interval, and in that frame Atlas is not sending sound through space, but modulating conditions that allow a different kind of wave to carry influence. Atlas also fits a threshold model, where the corridor forms only when geometry locks in, and once the corridor forms, the atmosphere begins to drift toward a new acoustic state, with the 47 minutes representing the time constant of that drift rather than a literal travel time. The anomaly sharpens because the delay appears to shorten later, which suggests that the system is not static but accelerating, and acceleration implies feedback, because feedback is how processes gain speed as they approach a stable operational mode. Atlas therefore becomes more than an object to track, because Atlas becomes a metronome that the planet seems to answer, and the emotional note is not fear but disorientation, the feeling that Earth is responding on schedule to something far beyond Earth. The transition follows naturally, because once a clock is identified, the next question is what medium carries the influence, and whether Atlas is shaping space itself to provide the pathway. To imagine a pathway where none should exist, the mind reaches for frameworks that treat space as active rather than empty, because the vacuum between Earth and Atlas is not a perfect nothingness, it is a structured stage with fields, constants, and geometry that can in principle be perturbed. Atlas does not need to send sound through space for sound to change on Earth, because Atlas could instead alter the conditions that determine how vibrations lose coherence inside air, and that shift could be mediated by a corridor where space-time properties are slightly different from the surrounding volume. The string hypothesis is a bridge concept, not a claim, because in higher dimensional theories the universe may contain additional degrees of freedom that are normally compactified, and if a mechanism could partially unfurl those degrees of freedom along a line of sight, then the corridor could behave like a medium capable of supporting longitudinal behaviour. Atlas fits this hypothesis only because the observations invite it, since alignment, timing, and repeatability resemble an engineered coupling more than a diffuse natural storm, and the corridor idea provides a single explanatory scaffold that can hold several anomalies at once. In this scaffold, Atlas is not a rock, and not a comet in the ordinary sense, because Atlas would be acting as a boundary condition that reshapes local space-time impedance, and Earth would be the receiver not by choice but by geometry. The anomaly remains that such reshaping should be vanishingly small at interplanetary distances, and yet even tiny perturbations can matter if they target the right variable. Because the atmosphere is a sensitive oscillator, and the ear is a sensitive instrument even when the ear is replaced by sensors, The emotional texture is a slow widening, as if the room of physics has gained an extra door that was always there but never opened, and at last is standing in the doorway without stepping inside. The transition is careful, because the next step is to look for measurable fingerprints of space-time change, and if constants that should be constant begin to drift, then the corridor becomes more than a metaphor and more like a parameter in the data. Fundamental constants are the quiet agreements of the universe, because they allow equations to remain stable across centuries of measurement, and when any constant appears to fluctuate even slightly, the significance is disproportionate to the size of the change. At-last enters this section as a directional anchor, since the reported variations are measured along the Earth-at-last axis, and the corridor concept predicts that any measurable deviation would be localized in that line of sight rather than distributed uniformly across the sky. A tiny shift in the fine structure constant, even at the level of a few 10,000ths of a percent, would imply that electromagnetic coupling is being modulated, and that modulation could change how energy transfers between modes, including the way acoustic vibrations dissipate in air. Atlas does not need to violate physics to make this plausible, because physics already permits constants to be effective rather than absolute in certain environments, and the question becomes whether the corridor is an environment with slightly altered vacuum properties. The anomaly is that instruments are designed to reject spurious drift, because calibration standards, reference sources, and cross-validation pipelines exist precisely to prevent analysts from mistaking noise for discovery, yet the claim persists across independent observations, which is why the corridor cannot be dismissed as a single faulty sensor. Atlas, therefore, becomes less like an intruder and more like a lens, because a lens does not add energy but rearranges pathways, and the corridor would be a kind of space-time lens that changes how signals behave without announcing itself in visible light. The emotional note is quiet awe, because it is one thing to learn that distant objects are strange, but it is another to suspect that the stage between observer and observed is changing shape, and that suspicion makes the familiar sky feel subtly less passive. The transition points toward institutional response, because once constants are implicated, agencies shift from curiosity to caution, and at last becomes the kind of anomaly that triggers protocols designed for situations where the data may outrun interpretation. Emergency protocols exist for a simple reason, because organizations that watch the sky cannot afford to improvise when the sky stops behaving, and the activation of a rare framework signals that uncertainty has crossed a threshold of consequence. Atlas is the implied catalyst, since the chain of anomalies, extreme absorption, aligned dampening zones, timing regularity, and possible constant drift, forms a narrative that cannot be filed as routine variation, even if each element alone might have been survivable inside the margin of doubt. A protocol does not prove danger, because protocols are often triggered by the absence of explanation rather than the presence of threat, and the most destabilizing scenario for any monitoring network is not an impact event, but an event whose mechanism cannot be bounded. Atlas creates that bounding problem, because Atlas sits far away while the effects appear locally, and local effects without local causes are the kind of pattern that forces agencies to coordinate, to restrict data flow, and to prevent premature public conclusions that cannot be supported. The anomaly is that silence is not normally a hazard category, since atmospheric acoustics is not a traditional space weather domain, yet when zones merge and behavior changes qualitatively, the classification of the event shifts from interesting to operationally relevant. Atlas also explains why fear can exist without spectacle, because fear in scientific institutions often manifests as restraint, and restraint looks like closed briefings, controlled language, and carefully neutral statements that still admit the models are failing. The emotional tone is a quiet tightening, not a panic, because the most honest form of alarm is the decision to keep measuring while refusing to guess, and that is what a protocol embodies when it is used correctly. The transition leads toward the most difficult observation, because once a zone moves from partial dampening to absolute silence, the phenomenon becomes less like a measurement artifact and more like a temporary rewrite of local reality, and at last remains the only distant variable that aligns with the geometry. Absolute silence is not merely the absence of noise, because in the physical world there is always motion, always thermal vibration, always pressure variation, and even the quietest ocean still carries a low, continuous murmur of energy. Atlas becomes the reference again when a zone is described not as reduced propagation, but as a momentary collapse of acoustic presence, where instruments report near zero ambient transmission and human observers describe an uncanny flattening of sensory space. The anomaly is not that sound is muffled, since muffling is common, but that sound appears to stop as if the medium has lost the ability to carry longitudinal disturbance, and that implies a change in the rules that define how air couples motion into waves. At last fits the corridor hypothesis because a localized deviation in fundamental coupling could act like a switch, and if the corridor intensifies, then the switch could flip fully for a brief interval before relaxing back to baseline. The emotional weight is strange precisely because it is gentle, because a silent patch does not explode or burn. It simply removes a layer of reality that the nervous system expects to be permanent. At last remains the transition point, because once silence becomes absolute even for minutes, the question shifts from what is at last made of to what is at last doing, and the next chapter must follow the data toward the second anomaly that appears between Earth and Atlas, like a punctuation mark placed deliberately in the dark. A new object appearing where nothing was recorded only days before is not automatically impossible, because detection limits exist and backgrounds can hide faint bodies, yet the specific description of a dark sphere emerging along the Earth-Atlas corridor forces the question of whether the absence was real or merely unrecognized. At last is the organizing axis of the observation, since the sphere is reported not off to the side but positioned within the same approach vector that already concentrates attention, and geometry like that turns a discovery into a potential event. In ordinary survey work, objects are found because they reflect sunlight or emit heat, and even cold debris carries an infrared signature above the cosmic background. Yet the sphere is described as nearly black in reflection and indistinguishable in thermal output from the sky itself. Atlas does not need to be causal for this to matter, because the corridor is already under scrutiny due to absorption and acoustic anomalies, and a second body in the same corridor multiplies the interpretive pressure rather than adding a separate mystery. The anomaly is the timeline because a within 72 hours emergence suggests either rapid insertion, rapid reveal, or a shift in observational capability, and each option carries a different implication about agency and mechanism. A cautious bridge explanation is that the sphere was always present but camouflaged by its low albedo and by observational priorities, and only when at last triggered intensified monitoring did the data pipeline integrate enough depth to resolve the faint lensing or positional signature. A sharper bridge explanation is that the sphere is a device, because a perfect sphere with near-zero reflection resembles engineered stealth more than a random fragment, and engineered stealth is consistent with a scenario where Atlas is being observed rather than merely tracked. The emotion here is a slow tightening of focus, because the story is no longer about one strange visitor. It is about a corridor that now contains two anomalies, and the transition is inevitable, since the next question is whether the sphere's geometry is merely aesthetic or a functional signature of design. Geometry in space is rarely clean, because collisions, accretion, and uneven heating sculpt bodies into irregular forms, and even objects that become spherical under gravity usually retain a blateness, scars, and asymmetries that reveal their history. Atlas becomes relevant again because the sphere is reported along the same line of sight that already behaves strangely, and when two anomalies share a corridor, the mind begins to treat the corridor itself as the system rather than either object alone. A sphere with near-perfect tolerance suggests manufacturing, because precision requires constraint, and constraint requires either strong gravity acting over geological time or deliberate engineering acting over short time, and the described scale does not fit a natural gravitational rounding process. Atlas does not prove the sphere is artificial, but Atlas sharpens the hypothesis space, because Atlas is interstellar, Atlas is anomalously absorptive, and Atlas is associated with timed terrestrial effects, so the sphere feels less like a random rock and more like a component. The anomaly is not simply a sphere exists, because a sphere could in principle exist, but that the sphere is both precise and placed, and placement is the detail that transforms a shape into a message. A conservative bridge remains possible, where the sphere is a rare natural body with unusual cohesion, perhaps a remnant of differentiated material shaped by processes we have not sampled, and the universe has a habit of producing edge cases that look designed when seen only once. Yet the emotional pressure persists, because edge cases usually arrive with messy signatures, while this sphere is described as clean, quiet, and exact, and exactness is the aesthetic of intention. The transition follows the data, because once geometry suggests constraint, The next step is to examine thermal behavior and reflectivity, and to ask how an object can be present without announcing itself through heat or light in the corridor that points toward Atlas. Thermal physics is usually unforgiving, because every object absorbs radiation and must re-emit energy according to temperature, and even the coldest bodies in the outer system glow faintly above the background if instruments are sensitive enough. Atlas remains the reference axis because the sphere's thermal signature is described as blending into the cosmic microwave background, and if the corridor between Earth and Atlas is already suspected to be altered, then perfect cold could be a property of environment as much as a property of surface. A surface that emits almost nothing could be interpreted as perfect insulation, yet perfect insulation still allows internal heat to accumulate unless the interior is also quiet, and that pushes the hypothesis toward either extreme heat management or a state where energy exchange is being redirected. Atlas does not demand a dramatic explanation, but Atlas makes dramatic explanations harder to ignore, because Atlas is associated with absorption across broad bands, and absorption without re-emission is the signature that breaks the simplest thermodynamic intuition. The anomaly is that a black body should radiate, and a perfect absorber should also be a perfect emitter, so a near-zero thermal signature suggests either measurement context is unusual, or the object is not behaving like a normal material surface. A cautious bridge explanation is that the sphere is coated in metamaterials that shape emissivity, scattering radiation into angles and frequencies that evade detection, and such shaping could mimic invisibility without violating conservation. A sharper bridge, often invoked because it feels mathematically clean, is the idea of an artificial compact object, yet the mass requirements for a true gravitational singularity would produce unmistakable dynamical effects that would not remain subtle. The emotional tone is quiet uncertainty, because the data implies concealment, and concealment is a behavior we associate with intention, and the transition is natural, because once heat and light refuse to reveal the object, the next clue must come from gravity and density in the same corridor that still points toward Atlas. Density is a stubborn parameter, because it links mass to volume, and therefore links what an object is made of to how the object must behave under forces, and when density estimates exceed the range of ordinary materials, the hypothesis space narrows quickly. Atlas remains part of the frame because the sphere is positioned between Earth and Atlas, and any mass associated with the sphere would influence trajectories, micrometeoroid paths, and subtle lensing effects along the corridor that already shows structured anomalies. A reported density above osmium suggests either exotic composition or an error in inference, because remote density estimates depend on gravitational interaction, and gravitational interaction depends on precise tracking, background modelling, and assumptions about unseen forces. Atlas complicates those assumptions, since if Atlas is already suspected of non-gravitational behaviour, then the corridor may contain forces that mimic gravitational deflection, and what looks like mass could be field curvature or a coupling artifact. The anomaly is that even if a material were denser than anything on Earth, the object would still need a formation pathway, and formation pathways leave signatures, because extreme densities usually require extreme pressures, and extreme pressures are associated with stellar interiors, rather than free-floating spheres in interplanetary space. A conservative bridge explanation is that the density is overestimated due to limited sampling and projection effects, where a smaller mass at a different distance can imitate a larger mass at the assumed distance, and the corridor geometry makes such degeneracy easier to fall into. A more speculative bridge is that the sphere contains compacted matter engineered for stability, because engineering can create constraints that nature rarely holds steady, and a stable dense sphere is consistent with a device meant to endure long durations, without radiating away its secrets. The emotional note is not dread but weight, because mass is a kind of authority in physics, and when an object carries too much authority for its size, the mind feels the floor tilt slightly. The transition is direct, because once density hints at design or distortion, the next question is whether the sphere is active, and activity reveals itself most clearly through motion, rhythm, and the kind of rotation that Atlas has already taught us to treat as meaningful. Rotation is one of the cleanest fingerprints in astronomy, because spin rates emerge from formation history and collisions, and natural bodies rarely maintain perfect stability without measurable drift over time. Atlas anchors the suspicion, because the sphere's rotation period is described as correlating with its distance from Earth in a way that feels too neat, and neatness is the one trait that makes coincidence feel expensive. A constant rotation period measured to multiple decimal places suggests mechanical regulation, since irregular shapes wobble and precess while uneven heating produces torque. Yet the sphere behaves like a metronome that refuses to wander. Atlas does not prove the sphere is engineered, but Atlas strengthens the corridor narrative, because if Atlas is associated with timed terrestrial effects, then a timed rotation in the same corridor reads like synchronization rather than random spin. The anomaly is the number itself, because repeating numbers across unrelated parameters often signal either selection bias or encoding, and the mind must be careful not to hallucinate meaning where there is only arithmetic. Still, Atlas remains the transition, because if the sphere is synchronized to Earth, then the corridor is not passive, and the next chapter must ask whether communication is occurring, and whether Atlas is approaching a rendezvous that was scheduled long before anyone on Earth noticed Atlas at all. The hydrogen line is not mystical, because it is simply the natural emission frequency of neutral hydrogen, and hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, which makes the frequency a shared reference point for any civilization that studies radio astronomy. Atlas enters the question because the corridor between Earth and Atlas now contains a sphere with unusual properties, and when a signal appears on a frequency long considered a rational meeting place, the event becomes difficult to treat as random noise. A directed pulse on the hydrogen line suggests intention, since natural emissions are typically broadband or spatially diffuse, and narrowband structure with temporal precision is the hallmark of engineered transmission rather than thermal radiation. Atlas does not need to be the sender for Atlas to matter, because Atlas is the context that elevates the pulse from curiosity to narrative, and the pulse becomes a bridge between two anomalies that already share geometry. The anomaly is not only the frequency, but the timing, because when a pulse duration matches a repeated numerical motif, the pattern begins to resemble a protocol, and protocols imply that the system expects a response. A conservative bridge explanation is that the pulse is an artifact, a terrestrial interference misclassified by coincidence, and that caution is necessary because the hydrogen line is heavily monitored and false positives have a long history. Yet the emotional pressure remains gentle but persistent, because if the pulse is real and directed, then Earth is not merely watching Atlas, since Earth may be sitting inside a channel where Atlas and the sphere are exchanging information. The transition is inevitable, because once a language is proposed, the next clue is whether the sphere can change state, and whether Atlas can answer. A mechanical aperture is a different kind of evidence, because it is not a number inferred from distance or noise, it is a change in structure, and structural change implies an internal mechanism capable of deliberate motion. Atlas remains central, because the aperture is described as facing Earth, while projecting coherent light along the corridor that leads toward Atlas. And that orientation makes the event feel less like random activity and more like alignment-driven behavior. Coherent laser emission is distinct from reflected sunlight, since it carries phase order and narrow wavelength precision, and precision is the signature that separates a passive body from an active system with control. Atlas does not need to be threatened for the implication to be profound, because even a harmless calibration beam would confirm that the sphere is doing something on purpose, and purpose is the first step toward communication. The anomaly is that a dark object that hides heat and reflection is suddenly willing to reveal coherence, as if concealment and signalling are being balanced according to a schedule, and schedules are the quiet language of machines. A cautious bridge is that the iris interpretation could be a data processing artifact, a transient contrast effect, or an imaging geometry illusion, and the hypothesis must remain conditional until multiple instruments confirm the same morphology. Still, the emotional tone shifts, because once the sphere behaves like an instrument, the corridor becomes a laboratory, and Atlas becomes the experiment's moving target. The transition follows naturally, because the next question is whether Atlas responds, and response is where a hypothesis becomes a story. A response is the hardest element to dismiss, because correlation can be argued away, but a mirrored behavior across distance begins to look like interaction, and interaction implies that two systems are aware of each other's state. Atlas becomes the focal point because the reported return signal originates from Atlas on the same hydrogen line frequency, and with a matching temporal structure, and matching structure is the simplest form of acknowledgement that physics allows. Natural objects can emit radio bursts, yet natural radio bursts do not typically match a narrowband channel chosen for interstellar signaling, and natural bursts do not usually align in time with an external stimulus that appears immediately beforehand. Atlas does not automatically become artificial because the universe can surprise us with plasma effects and resonance phenomena, and the responsible posture is to treat the match as a high-priority anomaly rather than a solved conclusion. The anomaly is that the pattern repeats where randomness should dominate, because if Atlas were merely reflecting, then the spectrum would smear and the timing would drift. Yet the reported structure holds its shape as if it were generated rather than echoed. A conservative bridge remains possible, where the sphere's emission triggers a natural stimulated response in Atlas's surrounding coma, and stimulated emission can produce narrow features under the right conditions, though those conditions would need to be extraordinary. The emotional note is quiet and heavy, because maybe begins to feel like almost, and Atlas begins to feel less like a visitor and more like a participant. The transition is clear because participation implies trajectory control, and the next section must examine whether Atlas is changing speed in a way that resembles intention. Deceleration is a subtle clue, because speed changes are common in the solar system, yet the causes are usually legible, and legibility is what keeps celestial mechanics reliable across long time spans. Atlas matters because Atlas is described as slowing with a steady measurable acceleration, and a steady acceleration is the shape of control, since random outgassing produces jitter, while gravitational influence produces curves tied to mass and distance. If Atlas is decelerating smoothly, then Atlas may be expending energy, and expending energy implies a mechanism, whether that mechanism is a natural jet, a magnetic interaction, or something engineered that does not announce itself in visible light. Atlas does not need to be a spacecraft for this to be meaningful, because even a natural object can behave non-linearly when heated, fractured, or torqued, and the honest task is to compare the measured curve to known cometry thrust models. The anomaly is that the deceleration is framed as constant and precise, and precision is the feature that keeps returning, from absorption to timing to rotation, as if the corridor is governed by rules that prefer stability. A cautious bridge is that the curve could be an artifact of limited observations, where early solutions overfit and later solutions relax toward normality, and that is why continuous tracking matters more than any single plot. Still, the emotional tone remains calm but attentive, because if Atlas is truly slowing toward the sphere, then the corridor is not a passing alignment, it is a meeting geometry. The transition is the countdown itself because meetings have schedules, and schedules turn the sky into a clock.